The letter came into her hands on a gray November morning, and she knew the writing before she knew. She knew it. Eleanor Bexley stood at the writing desk in the north sitting room of Ashcombe House, sorting the morning correspondence into the silver salver, as she had done every day for the 3 weeks of her service. And the hand on the topmost letter stopped her breath in her throat. It was a slanting hand, close and disciplined, the descender's lute. Just so, the capital letters leaning forward as though eager to be read. She had seen that hand once before. She had seen it folded into a square of paper that her father had carried to a field at dawn and never carried home. Her fingers held the letter as though it might grow warm, and the fire in the grate popped once, and somewhere below stairs, a bell rang for a servant who was not her, and Eleanor did not move. What she did not yet understand was that the man whose hand this was slept 2 floors above her, and that she had come to this house on purpose, and that the purpose she had told herself was not the whole of it. She had told the housekeeper she needed the work. And this was true. She had told herself she wished only to see the place, to stand once inside the walls that had swallowed the last quiet years of her life. And this was also true, in the way that half a thing is true. Yet the letter in her hand was the whole of it, and she had not known the whole of it until now. Stay with me a moment if you would, because what follows is the story of a woman who came to a great house carrying a grief 8 years old, and found it living upstairs in a body she had not expected to pity. Her father had been Thomas Bexley, a fencing master, a man who taught the sons of gentlemen how to hold a blade and never once raised his own in anger. He had kept a narrow set of rooms above a chandler's in a market town, and he had taught Eleanor her letters and her sums at the same table, where he cleaned his foils, and he had told her, more than once, that a man who drew steel over a word had already lost the argument. He believed this. He had died because another man did not. Eleanor was 26 years old now, and she had been 18 when they brought her father home in a cart with a coat laid over his face. She remembered the cart. She remembered the smell of the road on the man who drove it, and she remembered that no one would tell her the names. And she remembered above all that in her father's coat, folded small against his heart, there had been a letter. A second's letter, the kind sent to arrange the ground and the hour, written in a slanting, close, disciplined hand. She had kept it for 8 years. She kept it still, pressed flat, inside the cover of her mother's prayer book, and she had read it so many times that she could have drawn each letter with her eyes shut. She knew that hand the way she knew her own name. And here it was again, on a letter addressed to a tradesman in the town, sealed with the crest of the house she now served. The house belonged to the Earl of Ravensden, whose Christian name was Julian, and whom the servants called his lordship, and the county called Cold. He had inherited 3 years past, upon the death of a father he was said to have disliked, and he had married no one, and he entertained rarely, and he rode out alone most mornings before the household woke. Eleanor had been in his employ for 3 weeks, and had seen him perhaps 4 times, always at a distance, always in motion. A tall figure in a dark coat crossing a courtyard or a gallery with the particular economy of a man. She had thought him nothing to her. She had been wrong about that, and she had come here half knowing. She was wrong, and the letter in her hand had ended the half. She placed it on the salver. Her hands did not shake, which surprised her. She carried the salver up the great stair and along the gallery to the study, and she knocked, and a level voice bid her enter, and Eleanor went in to look at last upon the man whose writing had arranged her father's death. He was standing at the tall window with his back to the door, and the winter light came flat and gray around him, and he did not turn at once. He was younger than she had built him in her mind across 8 years of hating him. Not a gray conspirator in a cold field, but a man of perhaps 32, broad through the shoulder, dark-haired, with a stillness to him that was not ease. When he did turn, she saw a face that had learned to give nothing away and had paid for the lesson. His eyes were the gray of slate under rain. There was a small white scar at the edge of his left eyebrow, old and faded. He looked at her as though he were looking at furniture, and then, for reasons she could not name, he looked at her again. Longer, and something in the set of his mouth changed by a degree so small she almost missed it. "The Morning Post, my lord," she said, and set the salver on the desk, and stepped back with her eyes lowered as a servant should. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low and even, the words placed rather than spoken. "You are new." "3 weeks, my Lord Bexley," he said, and she felt the name in her spine like cold water, though he could not have meant anything by it, could not have known, and she made herself breathe. "You may go." She went. On the stair she stopped and held the banister, and let the trembling come, now that no one could see it. He had said her name, as though it were only a name. To him, it was. To her it was the whole of the field, the cart, the coat, the 8 years. She had found him. She did not yet know what she meant to do with the finding. The season below stairs at Ashcombe was its own small country, with its own borders and customs, and Eleanor learned them quickly, because she had always been quick. Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, ran the house like a well-oiled clock, and had taken to Eleanor for her neat hand and her still manner. There was a scullery maid named Sally, who talked too much, and a footman named Gordon, who talked too little, and a valet named Pruitt, who had served the Earl since before the title and guarded his master's privacy like a dog at a gate. And there was the boy. His name was Henry, and he was 5 years old, and he was the Earl's ward, the son of a dead friend, and the house did not quite know what to make of him. He had come to Ashcombe a year past, with a nurse and a trunk, and a silence too heavy for a child. He did not play as other children played. He watched. He haunted the low windows of the nursery wing in the cold end of the long gallery, and the servants said, kindly enough, that he was a strange little thing, poor mite, and left him to himself. Eleanor did not leave him to himself. She had been a strange little thing once in a set of rooms above a chandler's, and she knew what it was to be watched over by people too busy to be watched over by. And so when she found the boy sitting alone at the top of the back stair with his knees drawn up to his chin, she sat down beside him and said nothing at all, which was the only right thing to say. To the household, Mrs. Fenwick told her over tea, that first week, not unkindly, she was just a maid with sad eyes and a good hand for letters. Eleanor had smiled and said nothing, for the household was not wrong, only incomplete. She kept her own counsel below stairs as she had always kept it, and she let Sally chatter and Gordon brood and Pruitt watch her with his careful valet's eyes, and she gave none of them the one thing she carried. She rose before the others and pressed her one good apron, and pinned her hair plain, and went up to the writing desk in the gray of the morning to sort the post, and she told herself, each morning, that she was only a maid with a tidy hand, and each morning the telling held a little less. The prayer book stayed locked in her small trunk. The letter inside it stayed folded. And the man, 2 floors above her, rode out alone into the frost and came back, cold, and the house went on around its still center, and no one but Eleanor knew that the center had a crack in it that ran 8 years deep. The boy took to her the way cold takes to warmth. Within a fortnight he would leave the nursery to find her at whatever task she was set, and stand near and hand her clothespins or spools of thread with a grave particularity, and she talked to him while she worked, low and steady about nothing and everything, and slowly, slowly the silence in him loosened. She did not do it for the Earl. She did it because the boy was alone and she was near, and because there had been no one to sit beside her on the stair, when she was 18 and the world had gone quiet. She had learned then how a silence could be furnished, how a person could be kept company without a word, and she furnished the boy's silence now with the small, ordinary sounds of work, the click of a needle, the soft tear of thread, the low murmur of a story about nothing. He did not require her to be cheerful, he required only that she stay, and staying was the one thing Eleanor had always known how to do. What she did not know was that the Earl had seen them. He had come along the gallery one afternoon on his silent feet and stopped at the turning where the light fell and he had watched the maid with a still manner kneel down to the level of the child's face and say something that made the boy, who did not smile, very nearly smile. And the Earl had stood there for the length of 3 slow breaths, unseen, with an expression on his guarded face that no one in the county would have believed him capable of. Then he had gone away without a word. From that afternoon, though, he had begun to notice where she was. She would be crossing the hall and feel the particular weight of being seen, and look up, and he would be at the far end, turning away a half-second too late. He asked Mrs. Fenwick, once in Eleanor's hearing, whether the new maid was content in her situation, and Mrs. Fenwick said she was a treasure, my lord, and the Earl said nothing, but Eleanor's face went warm without her permission, and she was furious at it. This is the man, she told herself. This is the hand from the field. She held the thought like a shield. It did not work as well as it should have. One evening in the 2nd week of December, a hard frost came down, and the pipes in the nursery wing froze, and the little grate would not draw, and Henry could not sleep for the cold, and the nurse was ill abed, and so it was Eleanor who sat up with him, wrapped in a shawl in the low chair by his bed, telling him in a murmur the story of a fox who outwitted a hunt. The cold had got into everything. Her breath showed faintly in the light of the single candle, and the boy had burrowed down under 2 blankets and a shawl of her own, and only his eyes showed, dark and fixed on her face as she spoke, as though her voice were a rope he was holding in the dark. She had banked what fire the grate would take, and it gave more smoke than warmth, and she had wrapped her own hands in the corner of her shawl. And still she did not leave, because the boy's eyes told her that leaving was the thing he feared above the cold. The door opened without a knock. The Earl stood in it, with a candle, in his shirt sleeves, his cravat gone, looking for once like a man, not like a title. And he saw the maid in the chair and the boy at last asleep, and he did not order her out. "He does not sleep for me," the Earl said quietly. "He is not afraid of me, my lord," said Eleanor, before she had decided to be honest. "Children are afraid of grief. They can smell it. You carry a great deal of it." She should not have said it. It was far past her place, and she braced for the cold voice to send her down to Mrs. Fenwick, and out the door by morning. Instead, the Earl came into the room and set the candle on the mantel, and looked at the sleeping boy for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was lower still. "His father was my friend," he said. "I could not save him. I stood beside him, and I could not save him." He stopped, as a man stops at the edge of a thing. "Come away now. You will take a chill. That is not a request." It was a command, flat and dominant, and inside it, unmistakable to anyone who cared to hear, was the shape of care. "Come away. You will take cold." She rose and gathered her shawl, and at the door she paused, because a question had risen in her that she could not swallow. "How did his father die, my lord?" The Earl did not look at her. "Badly," he said. "And by my arranging, though I did not mean it so." "Go to bed, Miss Bexley." "Miss Bexley, not the household's maid with sad eyes." Miss Bexley said as though she were a person with a name and a history, and she went down the cold stair with her heart going hard because she had come to this house certain of one thing, and the one thing was beginning to have edges she had not drawn. That night she took her mother's prayer book from her small trunk and unfolded the letter she had carried 8 years, and she read it again by a single candle. And then she went very still. She had always read it for the hand. Now, she read it for the words. It was a second's letter. Yes, arranging the ground and the hour. It was also, she saw now, a letter, trying to prevent the thing it arranged. "Reconsider," it said, in that slanting, disciplined hand. "There is no honor in this, only a lie. A proud man will not withdraw. I beg you, as your friend, do not meet him. Come to me instead, and let us find another road." She had read those lines 100 times, and seen only the appointment. Tonight, she saw the plea inside it. The man who wrote this had not wanted the duel. He had begged against it. And her father had died anyway, because the other man, the proud man, the one who fired, would not be reasoned out of a lie. Buyer. Eleanor sat with the letter until the candle guttered. She did not know yet that the writer and the firer were not the same man. She had spent 8 years collapsing them into one villain, because one villain is easier to hate than a tangle of grief. Now the letter was pulling the tangle apart in her hands, and she was afraid of what it would leave. Holding. You have perhaps already guessed what she had not. Hold it gently. She was not ready. The days shortened toward Christmas, and the great house began, in its restrained way, to prepare for the small gathering the Earl held each year for the county families, more duty than pleasure, and the below-stairs world doubled its labor. Eleanor polished and mended and carried, and the boy trailed her, and the Earl found more reasons than a busy man should have had to be in the rooms where she was working. He brought Henry a wooden horse and watched, from the doorway, the boy show it to Eleanor before he showed it to anyone else. He asked her once, standing too near a window while she trimmed a lamp where she had learned to read so well, and she said her father had taught her. And something crossed his face, and he asked what her father had been, and she said with her eyes on the wick that he had taught fencing. And the Earl went absolutely still in the way of a man who has heard a floorboard creak in an empty house. He did not ask the town. He did not ask the year. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said only, "He taught you well," and left the room. And Eleanor stood with the trimming scissors in her hand and understood that he knew, or was very close to knowing, and that he was as afraid of the knowing as she was. The dismissive word came again 3 days before the gathering, and this time it was the Earl's aunt who said it. The Dowager Lady Ravensden had come to oversee the arrangements, as she did each year, a handsome, upright woman of 60, with a fan she held always a half-inch too high, and a voice that could correct a footman across a ballroom without seeming to rise. She had brought with her a young lady named Miss Cordelia Vane, the daughter of an old connection, poised and pale gold and perfectly turned out, whom the Dowager intended, with the serene certainty of a woman who had never been thwarted, for her nephew. Eleanor, carrying a tray, heard the Dowager say to Miss Vane in the morning room, "The child has grown fond of one of the maids, I am told. A Bexley creature, a nobody with a tidy hand. It will not do to have Julian's ward attached to a servant. We shall find him a proper governess in the spring. A nobody with a tidy hand." Eleanor set down the tray without a rattle, and went out with her back straight, and if her eyes stung she did not let it show, for she had been called worse and by better, and the word was not the thing that hurt. The thing that hurt was how near it sat. To true, Miss Vane was not cruel. This must be said, because it would be easier if she were. She had been raised to believe herself the correct answer to a question the Earl had not asked, and she played the pianoforte in the drawing-room in the evenings with real feeling. And once, passing the nursery, she stopped and spoke gently to Henry, who did not answer her, and she looked, for a moment, genuinely sad about it before she moved on. She was a person whose whole life had told her she was the sensible choice, and she had believed it, and she was about to learn, in front of the county, that she was not. And Eleanor would find, when the moment came, that she could not entirely hate her for it. The Earl grew stranger as the gathering neared. Twice Eleanor came upon him in the library at odd hours, a branch of candles lit, a small locked box open on the desk before him, papers in his hands. The second time he did not hear her at the door, and she saw his face bent over the pages, and it was the face of a man reading his own indictment. He closed the box when he noticed her, and said her name, Miss Bexley, in a voice gone rough, and asked her to bring him coffee, and when she brought it, his hand shook, very slightly, as he took the cup, and their fingers touched at the china, and neither of them moved, for the space of a breath that was far too long. And the whole cold room seemed to lean toward that single point of warmth before they both drew back as though burned. The coffee steamed between them. He did not drink it. He set it down untouched and looked at the closed box on the desk as though it might speak. And Eleanor, who should have gone, stood a moment longer than a servant ought, watching the candlelight move on the lines of a face that the county had agreed to call cold, and that she was no longer sure she could call anything so simple. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there her first week. He worked at night now. She had noticed, over papers he locked away by day, and whatever the papers were, they were eating him. And Eleanor found, to her own dismay, that she did not like to see it. Eleanor went down the stair with the memory of his fingers on hers and hated herself, and did not stop feeling it. She should have gone to him then. She knew who he was, or thought she did, and he half knew who she was, and between them lay a letter 8 years old that would either bind them or break them. Still, she was a maid and he was an earl, and the space between those two words was the whole of the world she lived in, and so she said nothing, and carried the letter's weight alone, and let the days close down toward the gathering like a hand closing. The evening of the gathering, the great drawing-room of Ashcombe blazed. Every candle in the house had been lit, and the long room glowed gold, and the county came in its silks and its diamonds, and the dowager stood at the head of it all, with Miss Vane arranged at her side like a jewel in a setting, and the earl moved among his guests with his cold, correct courtesy, and Eleanor, who had no business in that room, was sent up from below with a message for Mrs. Fenwick, and found herself for one moment standing at the edge of the light in her plain gray stuff gown among all that saturated color, a still figure. The room's eyes slid over as though she were a shadow the candles had thrown. The dowager's diamonds threw back the light in hard, bright points. Miss Vane's gown was the pale gold of the candle flames themselves, and she stood at the pianoforte, turning a page of music, with her gloved fingers poised, and perfect, and precisely where a future countess ought to stand. Against all of it, Eleanor's gray stuff gown drank the light, and gave nothing back, and her hands folded before her were the raw-knuckled hands of a woman who worked, and she was aware of every inch of the distance between the edge of the light where she stood and the bright center where the county had gathered to admire what it had already decided to. Admire she would have gone. She meant to go. Then two things happened, close together, and the evening turned. The first was that Henry, who had been put to bed an hour past, appeared at the foot of the great stair in his nightshirt, having escaped his nurse, drawn down by the light and the music and some small terror of the dark, and he stood there frozen and overwhelmed at the sight of the crowded, glittering room, and his face began to crumple. The dowager saw him, and her mouth tightened. A servant started toward him to bundle him away, and the boy, casting about in his fright for the one safe thing, saw Eleanor at the edge of the light, and ran to her and buried his face in her plain gray skirts, and the whole bright room turned to look. The second thing was that the earl crossed the room. He did not hurry. That was the terrible dignity of it. Set down his glass, and he came the length of that long golden room in the sight of every family in the county, past his aunt, past Miss Vane, past the correct future everyone had drawn for him, and he did not go to the servant who would have removed the child. He came to Eleanor and the boy at the edge of the light. The music had stopped. The dowager had risen. In the silence in front of them, all the earl went down on one knee before his ward, at the level of the maid who held him, and he put one hand on the boy's shaking back, and one hand briefly, steadyingly, over Eleanor's where it cradled Henry's head, and he looked up into her face. The dowager's voice cut across the room, low and polished and calibrated to wound, while remaining perfectly polite. "Julian, the servant will take the child. This is hardly the place." The earl rose. He kept the boy against his side. He turned to face the room, and Eleanor saw the mask that 8 years and a whole county had believed in simply come away from his face, and beneath it was something raw and settled and entirely decided. "She stays," he said. 3 words, level and clear, carrying to every corner of the silent room. "The child is mine to raise, and she is the only peace he has known, and I will not have her called a nobody in my house." It was more than the minimum and less than a speech, and it was said once and not repeated. Miss Vane's gloved hand rose to her throat. The dowager's fan came down. and Eleanor stood in the center of a room that had decided an hour ago not to see her, and felt the whole weight of its attention turn, and did not know that the hardest part of the night was still before her, because the Earl was not finished, and neither, she would find, was she. He sent the guests home early, with a courtesy that brooked no argument, and the dowager swept out with Miss Vane and a great deal of unsaid fury, and the candles were let to burn down, and when the house had emptied of everyone who did not belong to it, the Earl found Eleanor in the cold gallery where she had gone to breathe, and he stood a little apart from her, and for a moment neither of them was master and servant, only two people who had each been carrying half of the same terrible thing. "You know who I am," he said. It was not quite a question. "I know your hand, my lord," Eleanor said. "I have known it for 8 years." She reached into the pocket of her apron, where she had carried it down that evening without letting herself ask why, and she drew out the folded letter, soft at the creases, and held it out to him across the cold air between them. "You wrote this to a man who meant to fight my father. You begged him not to." The Earl took the letter. He did not need to unfold it. She watched him recognize his own 8-year-old plea, and she watched the last of the mask go. And when he looked up, his slate-gray eyes were wet, which she had not thought them capable of. "I was second to a man I called friend," he said, low and level and terrible. "He had convinced himself your father cheated his brother at cards, which was a lie. A proud man's lie he could not climb down from. I wrote and wrote, begging him to withdraw it. I stood on that field, at dawn, certain I had talked him out of it. And he raised his arm, and he fired before the count was done. His hand closed on the letter. Your father put his own pistol down. I saw it. He would not fire on a boy who had lost his reason. He put it down, and your father's friend killed him for a lie, and I have carried that dawn every morning of my life since he stopped. I did not know his daughter had come to my house. I swear to you, I did not know. And these 3 weeks I have thought only that the world had sent me one good thing and I did not deserve it, and now I find it is the one thing I have least right to want." Eleanor stood very still. 8 years she had built a single villain out of grief, and now the grief was pulling apart in her hands into its true and unbearable pieces, and the man before her was not the firer but the one who had begged against the firing, the one who had watched her father lay down his pistol, the one who had carried that dawn as long as she had carried this letter. She thought of the boy, asleep at last. She thought of the fingers that had shaken at the china. She thought of her father, who had told her that a man who drew steel over a word had already lost, and who had proved it by laying his own weapon down. "My father would not have blamed you," she said, and found as she said it that it was true, and that saying it set something down that she had carried too long. He blamed the drawing of steel, not the man who begged against it. "You may blame me," the Earl said. "I would understand it." "I did," said Eleanor. "For 8 years, I came here to blame you to your face." She looked at the letter in his hand. "I find I cannot. I find I do not wish to." The gallery was very quiet. Somewhere a clock told the half-hour. The Earl took one step, and then another, closing the space between the maid and the master that was the whole of the world she lived in, and he stopped just short of her, near enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air, and he lifted one hand and did not quite touch her face, his fingers hovering at the line of her jaw, as though she were something he had no right to and wanted past all reason. "I have no business asking you for anything," he said, his voice unsteady for the first time since she had known him. "I have wanted, since I saw you kneel to that child, only to be near you. It has kept me awake. It is the one want I have permitted myself in 3 years, and it is the one I have least right to. Tell me to stop, and I will never speak of it again." "I will not tell you to stop," Eleanor said, barely above a breath, and she turned her cheek the last small distance into his waiting hand, and his fingers closed against her skin, warm and certain, and she felt her own heart going like a bird against a window, and neither of them moved to more than that, because more than that could not be unmade. And both of them knew it, and both of them held at the edge of it, breathing in the cold, gold-lit gallery for a long, trembling moment that was chaster than a kiss and warmer than one. He did not kiss her that night. He held her face in his hand and pressed his brow to hers, and they stood so. Two people who had each carried half of a dead man's mourning, until the cold drove them apart, and when he stepped back he took her hand and pressed his mouth to the raw knuckles of it, the hands of a woman who had worked, and he said, not as an earl to a maid, "I will not have you. So as Julian, if you will have him. To Eleanor I mean, to marry you, and I mean the county to know it, and I mean my aunt to hear it from me before she hears it from anyone." The dowager heard it from him the next morning, in the library, with the door open, and Eleanor asked to be present, which was itself the whole of his intention made plain. The dowager sat very upright, and held her fan a half-inch too high, and told her nephew in her polished wounding voice that he would ruin himself, that the girl was a nobody, that the county would never receive her, that Miss Vane was the sensible and correct choice, and had been raised to it. "Miss Vane is a good woman, and deserves a man who chose her," the Earl said, level and unmovable. "I did not. Her name is Eleanor Bexley. Her father was Thomas Bexley, a fencing master, a better man than the one who killed him, and I was on the field the morning he died, and I have wanted to set that morning right for 8 years, and never once knew how. Now I know how." He did not raise his voice. He did not humiliate her. He simply left her no ground to stand on. "You may receive her aunt, or you may retire to the dower house at Marbury. Both are open to you. Only one is open to you here." The dowager's fan came down slowly into her lap. She looked at Eleanor for a long moment, and Eleanor met her eyes and did not look away. And something in the old woman's certainty cracked and settled into something older and quieter, which was not warmth, not yet, but was no longer war. "The Bexley girl," she said, almost to herself, testing the shape of a future she had not drawn. She rose. She did not apologize, for women of her generation and station did not, but at the door she stopped and said, without turning, "The child sleeps for her. That is not nothing." And she went out, and it was from a woman like the dowager, very nearly a blessing. Miss Vane left the next day. Before her carriage came round, she found Eleanor in the hall, and looked at her with clear, pale eyes, and said simply, "He never once looked at me, the way he looked at you across that room. I had rather know it now than after a wedding." She almost smiled. "The boy is fortunate in you." And she drew on her gloves and went out to her carriage. And out of the story corrected but not crushed, and Eleanor found she was glad of it. They were married in the parish church at Ashcombe on a morning in late January, when the snow lay clean over the park, and the light came through the old glass in long-colored bars. It was a quiet wedding, more family than county, though a surprising number of the county came, drawn by the story that had already run the length of the shire, of the cold earl who had gone down on one knee before his ward in front of everyone, and claimed a maid with sad eyes. Henry stood between them in a new coat, and did not let go of Eleanor's hand through the whole of it. And when the vicar spoke the words, the boy looked up at her, and at last, in front of the small warm crowd, he smiled. "That is nearly the end. Stay for the last of it." On the evening of her wedding day, Eleanor sat with her husband in the small warm study that had once frightened her, the fire high in the grate, the snow falling past the tall window in the last gray light, and Henry, asleep at last on the sofa, with the wooden horse held against his chest. She took her mother's prayer book from her pocket, and she drew out the folded letter, soft at the creases from 8 years of reading, and she looked at the slanting, disciplined hand that had first brought her to this house, believing she came to accuse. "I do not need to carry it any longer," she said. Julian took it from her and looked at it a long moment, his own younger plea, and then he rose and crossed to the fire, and he paused with it in his hand, and he looked back at her, and she nodded, and he laid the letter on the coals. They watched it, curl and catch and take the flame, the slanting words going gold and then gray, the dawn it had arranged finally, wholly released into warmth. It was gone in a moment. Julian came back and sat beside her and took her worked hand in his and pressed his mouth to the knuckles again, as he had that first night, and outside the snow came down over the park that was hers now, over the church where her name had changed, over the long, cold field wherever it lay, where a good man had once laid down his pistol rather than fire on a fool. The boy stirred and did not wake. The fire settled. Eleanor Ravenston leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and watched the snow, and thought of her father who had taught her letters at a table where he cleaned his foils, and who had been proved right in the end about the drawing of steel, and who would, she believed, have been glad to know that the hand he never saw beg for him had. 8 years on, begged for his daughter too, and been answered. The last of the letter fell to ash in the grate. Outside the snow kept falling, and the house was warm, and the child slept, and the hand that had once arranged a death now held hers by the fire. And neither of them, for the first time in 8 long years, was carrying the mourning alone. Thank you for staying to the end of it. If Eleanor's story moved you, leave a word below with the moment that stayed with you, and be gentle with the griefs you carry, for some of them, given time and light, turn out to be smaller and kinder than the shape we gave them in the dark.